Good evening and welcome to a special edition of The Beat from Washington on the first workday since the Mueller probe ended, with no chargeable collusion and an open question on whether Donald Trump obstructed justice. My exclusive guest tonight is former Attorney General Eric Holder, who served under President Obama and is on The Beat tonight for his first interview since the Mueller probe ended. Thank you for being here.
It's good to be here.
Before we get to your assessment of all this, what does it mean that this probe ended with 37 indictments? What did they find? What did they not find?
Well, it certainly found, and I guess the headline is that the campaign was not colluding with Russia, but I think it also found very significantly that the Russians in two ways tried to influence our election, both through the use of social media and through hacking. And, you know, that already takes me back to Helsinki. That is a consistent finding with what the intel community has been telling the president over these many, many months. And I think about him standing there in Helsinki, in spite of the fact that he had this information from the intel community, and essentially saying that I believe this guy, and pointing at Vladimir Putin, as opposed to the people who are sitting in front of me, the intelligence community. Bob Mueller has really put in terms that are not intel speak, a very compelling case that the Russians, in fact, did that which Donald Trump has seemed so reluctant to admit.
Does the lack of the conspiracy indictment clear Donald Trump of collusion?
I think it does. I mean, on the basis of what I have seen, I've not seen the Mueller report, but certainly on the basis of the letter that Attorney General Barr put together, it would seem to me that that is a substantial finding there. And I think it's good news for, for the president and for his campaign. Good news
for the president. Now, before we turn to obstruction, let's talk about the letter. All we have today is the 4-page Barr letter, not the Mueller report. What does it say to you that Barr's letter never quotes even a complete sentence from the Mueller report, let alone a paragraph?
Yeah, it's a little troublesome because you look at the letter and you're trying to figure out how much of this is Barr, how much of this is Mueller, how much of this is based on the Mueller findings. I think it all points to the fact that at the end of the day, Congress, the public, are going to have access to the Mueller report. And then also, I think, hear from both Bob Mueller and from Attorney General Barr.
When you were Attorney General, would you ever get prosecutors providing information without a charging recommendation?
No. I was Attorney General for 6 years, third longest serving Attorney General in the history of the United States. I never received anything from a prosecutor that did.
Never once?
Not once.
So what does that mean about what Barr says Mueller has done so far?
I think that what Bob Mueller was doing there was presenting something as best he thought he should do under the obligations that I think he faced. I think he was taking into account the Justice Department regulation that says you cannot indict a sitting president, and I think that really changed the way in which Bob Mueller conducted his probe. I mean, I've known Bob Mueller for 30 years.
You hired him?
I hired him in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, D.C., so I'm going to the toughest parts of Washington, D.C., make homicide cases, made him the U.S. Attorney in San Francisco. He was the Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division. This is a guy who has the ability to, and the Constitution, to make tough decisions. And the fact that he did not make a call here, I think, is an indication that he did what he thought he was supposed to do, given the strictures that he was under.
Well, let's get into it with those strictures. Barr asserts, without quoting Mueller, that essentially, by not giving a charging recommendation, it leaves it to Barr to determine whether Donald Trump's conduct constitutes a crime. Is that right?
I don't see that. I don't see that at all. It would seem to me that the more logical thing to do would be for Bob Mueller to have made these factual determinations, and then for the Attorney General to receive those and say full stop, and think about where this information then needs to go. And from my perspective, it seems that it needs to go to Congress.
So when Barr, in his letter, suggests this is up to him, is he right or wrong about that?
I think he's wrong. I mean, I think he is taking on to himself a role that has not typically been used by people in the position that Bob Barr has had.
You mentioned typically?
Yes.
For your analysis, let's look at the Nixon example, where the prosecutor Jaworski had a probe and did not offer a conclusion on obstruction, saying he would allow, quote, the House to determine what action was warranted. In the somewhat controversial Ken Starr example, he did not formally offer a conclusion on obstruction, noting it was not the role of his office to determine whether the president's actions warrant impeachment. Is Barr, through his letter, violating those precedents?
You know, that's kind of a strong term, violating those precedents, but I think he's acting in a way that's inconsistent with those precedents, and I would say inconsistent. Is he departing from those precedents? Sure, he's certainly departing from those precedents, and I would say he's acting in a way that's inconsistent with the best practice. It would seem to me that having received the information in the way that he did from Bob Mueller, that Attorney General Barr should have taken that information and then, you know, packaged it in the appropriate form and sent it to the House for consideration.
Do you know why he would be taking that approach if, as you say, it's so unusual?
I don't know, and that's one of the reasons why I think his testimony before the House, Bob Mueller's testimony before the House, the examination of the report is so critical. It seems hard for me to imagine that Bob Mueller asked Bill Barr to do this. That seems, because that would be Bob Mueller shifting the responsibility for making the call to the Attorney General, and that's just not the way in which Bob Mueller is wound. That's just not the way he's wound.
That is really striking coming from you as an Attorney General, one of the few people who's been in those shoes and understands what is unusual here. And as you say, someone who knows Bob Mueller so well. You hired him, and I want to show you a little bit of a younger Eric Holder giving a tribute to Mueller on his retirement as FBI director. Take a look.
In every endeavor, Bob's skill, his intellect, his excellent judgment, his humility, and his natural sense of leadership were on constant display.
When you think about that, do you think it's possible we would later hear Bob Mueller's view of this, either through what he wrote in the report and whether this was intended for Congress, or a rebuttal to what you say is Barr departing from precedent this weekend?
Do I think that we would hear from
Mueller?
I think that what we heard from Mueller was him doing what he thought he was supposed to do, given the parameters within which he was working. He is, he's a dedicated civil servant. He's an ex-Marine. You know, he follows orders. He understands the mission. He completes the mission, and I think he completed the mission in the way that he thought he was supposed to do it.
Preet Bharara was a U.S. attorney who you also oversaw.
Good man.
I want to play for you what he is saying about this, because some are putting this on Barr, as you just did. He seemed to accept Barr's explanation, even though we haven't gotten the Mueller report, and say Mueller is abdicating his role. Take a look.
My first reaction was it seems to be an abdication of responsibility. You give a case to a special prosecutor, a special counsel, for that person to make a prosecutive decision. He did not. So he punts to Congress, and then sort of Bill Barr runs on the field, takes the ball, and runs it in for a touchdown for the president.
Your reaction?
You know, I respect Preet a great deal, but I think he's wrong there. I mean, I think Bob was faced with just a couple of possibilities. Given the fact that he could not indict, he had the possibility of declining prosecution, and he thought there was too much evidence, I think, there to decline. If you look at the letter talks about he's not exonerating anybody, so he's not in a position to decline the case. The only other option that he had was to put this case in as good a form as it could, with the expectation that somebody would do something with it. And if past precedent is any guide, that would be the Attorney General or somebody in the Justice Department shipping out that which he put together to Congress for consideration.
When you look at the letter, there were two very negative things about obstruction for Donald Trump that Barr felt the need to include. One, that there are other secret actions that Mueller uncovered that Trump took that go to the obstruction analysis, and he didn't release what they are. And two, as you just mentioned, that Mueller did not exonerate Donald Trump on obstruction. Given what you've just explained to us, how are we supposed to interpret Barr including that negative information while going beyond Mueller to say he doesn't think Trump committed obstruction?
Well, I think in some ways, I think the Attorney General is maybe trying to cover himself so that he can say, I was pretty fulsome in the letter that I prepared. And in spite of, that fulsome nature in which I described that which Mueller did, I made the determination that there was not a basis to proceed. From my perspective, the fact that he says that there's information that we don't have access to, that the president is not exonerated, means that there has to be, as there has been, an examination by Congress to make a determination about whether or not further action and what kind of further action is necessary. The injection of the Attorney General to come in, especially this Attorney General, after that 17-page memo or whatever it was that he wrote, some months ago before he was Attorney General, I would think that given that history and this determination, I would have been a little hesitant if I were Attorney General Barr to make the determination here. Now, I think he attaches Rod Rosenstein to the determination, but I don't think that is sufficient to get me, or I think many other people, beyond a concern that the appropriate process was followed.
That's significant coming from you. I mean, it sounds alarming, I think, for people listening to you as an Attorney General with knowledge of this, saying, number one, this is never how prosecutors submit information, and number two, the precedent, whether you like the findings or not, has always been that if there is a potential high crime by the president, it's the Congress who deals with it. And that's interesting because we've heard from Ken Starr on this show about that. And although I think the two of you may disagree about much, you seem to overlap at least on the fact that, yes, it is Congress, not NAG, even one like yourself or Bill Barr or others, who decides this. Take a listen to Ken Starr.
Okay.
I'm saying the House of Representatives took the evidence and said, we have a duty to do what we feel obligated to do.
That's what you had them do.
The statute, and it's no longer a defect that Bob Mueller has to live with, is that the statute set the bar very low for providing information that may constitute grounds for impeachment.
Isn't that what obstruction by a president would always be about? Not prejudging the Mueller report, which we haven't seen, but the process is the House decides what to do about it, if anything.
Sure. And obstruction is the thing that certainly brought down Richard Nixon. It is something that the House is institutionally familiar with. But let me be very clear. I don't want people to leave with the impression that I'm saying that Bill Barr has done something that's inconsistent with his duties as Attorney General, that he's doing something in a way that I'm questioning his integrity. I think what I'm concerned about is that he has this really expansive view of executive power, the power of the executive branch. And my concern is that might have somehow infected his decision about how he was going to handle what he got from Bob Barr.
Understood. I haven't heard
from Bob Mueller.
From Bob Mueller. I haven't heard you speak to his integrity at all, but I'm hearing you say, echoed by the history we just showed and people like former prosecutor Starr, that the notion that this would be wrapped up by the Attorney General is odd. Just as Janet Reno did not resolve the Clinton issue, Attorney General Richardson did not resolve the Nixon issues. And so Barr, as you say, is putting it a maximalist position. There's one other thing about all this that I got to ask you,
Sure.
And I just don't know what happened here. I'm curious if you do. There is a requirement under the rules that Congress should be notified about the decisions about who to charge and not charge. And on Friday, Barr said he was going to do that as soon as this weekend. Does this letter constitute that? Because it seems to deal very hermetically with a few things, but doesn't in any way tell Congress about the other individuals or other issues under investigation that were declined to be charged. Does that requirement still have to be met by the Attorney General?
Yeah, I think it still has to be met, and I think it was anticipated that that would be met by a fulsome disclosure to Congress about the things that you have just mentioned and all the other things that Congress needed in order to make a correct decision as to what action should be taken with regard to a president who was under investigation.
It sounds like Eric Holder, former Attorney General of the United States tonight, is saying the conspiracy collusion aspect of this is clearly over based on what Mueller has done, and the obstruction questions are just beginning for analysis.
Oh, I think the obstruction questions, I certainly would agree with your characterization of my views on collusion, but with regard to obstruction, I think we're really at the beginning, maybe the middle of this whole process. Findings have been made. We need to see what those were. We need to see exactly what was the nature of the interaction between Bob Mueller and Bill Barr. And then we also need to understand how was it that Bill Barr reached these conclusions? What were the things that he went through? What laws did he apply? What rules did he apply? How did he interpret the appropriate rules and statutes? How did he apply the facts? This is just, a four-page memo that makes some really consequential determinations, and it seems to me that the American people and Congress are entitled to hear substantially more than simply this document.
Former Attorney General Eric Holder, thank you so much for coming on The Beat tonight, sir.
Good to be here.